Hello, everybody. Let's talk about Inside Llewyn Davis, the Coen brothers movie from 2013. This is a movie that we've talked about a lot over the years here at In Session Film. For those that have listened to the podcast, you may know that this is one of my favorite films of all time. On episode 500, what was that, just last year, we talked about our top 20 movies of all time. This film sits at number 20 on my list. It is my favorite film of 2013. It was my number 2 film of the 2010s, which is a list that we did on episode 363, if anyone wants to go and check that out. It's made many top 3 lists over the years on the podcast. It's one of my favorite soundtracks from any film that I've seen. It might turn off some. I know this is maybe a little polarizing because their filmography is so deep and rich, but it is my favorite Coen brothers movie. It's their most melancholic. It's really funny. It's extremely well crafted. I'll get into all of that here in a moment, but I don't think there is a false note in this movie. From the music to the production design, it's all impeccable. So with that in mind, as this film prepares to celebrate its 10th anniversary, which is crazy to me that it's been 10 years already, I want to talk about why this is a masterpiece, why it is the Coen brothers' best movie, why it is my number 2 film of the 2010s, and why it's one of my favorite films of all time. And I guess as we get going here, let's talk about the music and how that informs Llewyn Davis throughout this film. The music in this movie is astounding. It's a phenomenal folk soundtrack. Every track is mesmerizing. It's so good. Absolutely incredible. But there's also this contrast between Oscar Isaac as Llewyn and Marcus Mumford, who is the voice of Llewyn's former partner Mikey. And on the soundtrack, they are great together. But with Llewyn throughout the film, while he is very good, there is something missing still. It's not quite as clean as what you hear on the record with him and Mikey together. And I don't think that was an accident. I'll talk more about that here shortly. But the music on the whole in this film, soundtrack or in the context of the film, it's exquisite. Oscar Isaac, oh my gosh. He is so good in this film. It is one of the best performances of the 2010s. He should have won the Oscar for Best Actor, which is something that I also denoted on episode 363 when we talked about Best of the Decade, because I think he's in my top 5 for Best Actor for the 2010s. He's that good. His reaction shots in this film are nothing short of sublime. Sometimes it's bitingly hilarious. Other times it's poignant and sorrowful. And that duality is striking as Llewyn wrestles with his identity in this film, because it's not just an examination of a struggling artist or a young man trying to come to terms with how unlucky he is and that he is not going to make it as a musician. And Llewyn is very unlucky in many respects. But Llewyn's crisis isn't rooted in that. At the heart of this film, at the nucleus of Inside Llewyn Davis, his identity crisis here is born out of grief. What we find out early on in the film is that his music partner, Mikey, had recently committed suicide. And what we see in Llewyn, every choice he makes is a result of undealt with grief. As a result, his identity is constantly wavering as he attempts to be this solo act, which he struggles with, not because he isn't talented, he very clearly is, but at every turn he's constantly reminded of how he and Mike were great together. I mean, how many times is Mike brought up to him unprompted? It happens often. Or there's references to groups and trios. Hey, look at how great they are together, as to suggest that being in a group is better. And so he becomes stuck in this cyclical rut that isn't any fault of his own doing, and it's heartbreaking to watch. Llewyn is a bit abrasive at times, but when you consider what's driving his bitterness and how he arrived there, there's plenty of empathy to be had For example, and I want to take a look at quite a few examples because, as I said, I do think this is the beating heart of the movie. Let's look at the dinner scene at the Gorfines' apartment about a third of the way through this film. And there comes this moment where the Gorfines ask Llewyn to play a song as they settle in for the night. It's honestly one of the more insightful moments of the film because it tells us a lot about Llewyn and his emotional state as someone who is struggling to grieve. And also, he's struggling with his own ego as well. I love his reaction when they first ask him to sing, as he refutes them by saying, "Look, I'm not a trained poodle." It's really funny. Oscar Isaac delivers that line impeccably. But it does demonstrate how Llewyn sees himself above being a guy who is going to sing in these small social gatherings. He sees himself as a true artist who only performs when the situation is professional. At one point in the scene, he says, "It's not a parlor game. This is something I do for a living." To his credit, though, he does play fairly well, one of my favorite songs on the soundtrack. But it doesn't take long for the wheels to fall off as Mrs. Gorfine starts harmonizing with Llewyn as she's performing Mike's harmony. And Llewyn loses his mind. He gets really angry and verbally antagonistic toward the Gorfines. And as off-putting as Llewyn is in the moment, more than anything, it poignantly denotes his grief and heartache. The visual of him lowering his head when Mrs. Gorfine starts harmonizing is genuinely heartbreaking. And that's noteworthy because we know that it has nothing to do with her, which is indicative of his apology to her later on in the film, but rather it's clear that he just wants it to be Mike. And his grief gets the best of him in that moment, which is why his outburst is cathartic, even if he's being a bit boorish. And Oscar Isaac is so good in how he tiptoes that line of heartache and antagonism. Some other examples, very early on in the film, we get that scene where Llewyn is looking at the album cover of If We Had Wings, his album with Mike, and he starts to play Fare Thee Well. And there's a shot of Llewyn as he reminisces at the cover that I think is just pure gold. Again, it's introspective. Llewyn doesn't have to say anything. It's all reflective, and it tells us so much about Llewyn in that moment. And the sequence that follows as the song becomes non-diegetic, I just think is really fantastic in immersing us into Llewyn's life at this place and time. There's that brief moment we see with him over at Al Cody's apartment, and he's laying on this couch. There's this nice overhead shot of him laying on the couch, boxed in almost as if he's laying in his own coffin, which I think is incredible symbolism. It taps into the sorrow and melancholy of the film, but it's the Coen brothers, so there's a level of comedy to it as well. And I love that tonal polarity there. And then there's the whole driving to Chicago sequence where we meet Roland, played by John Goodman, and he asks Llewyn about his music partner. And Llewyn tells him that he jumped off the George Washington Bridge, to which Roland remarks, "The George Washington Bridge, what is he, a dumbbell?" It's a brief but very potent response back where Llewyn simply says, "Not really." His reaction shot, I think, is so incredible because it's born out of not just grief and anger, but of love. He's very much implying that Mike is anything but dumb, that he was smart, that he was a great musician. And as we know, Llewyn is still very much hurting over this loss. Those two words, "not really," carry so much weight. It's powerful. And again, the performance is incredible. It's subtle and yet extremely, extremely effective. I think the book ends of this film quintessentially exhibit this idea as well. In that opening scene, we hear Llewyn play "Hang Me, Oh Hang Me" as he's on stage there, which is an ironic song choice in many regards, as it lyrically talks about hanging and being dead and gone. And given how much he's struggling, it makes this song choice all the more poignant. And it's cathartic. The way Oscar Isaac sings it taps into those dualities within Llewyn with extreme effectiveness. It's sorrowful. There's a despondency to it The raw intimacy of this moment is so alluring and absorbing. There's no denying the mournful delicacy of how this moment is staged, how it is performed by Llewyn. And again, Oscar Isaac is just so great in how he's able to tap into that with Llewyn. The composition and staging here, I do want to talk about the Coens' cinematography and their direction here in a little bit, but those gray, hazy aesthetics, I think, set the mood impeccably as well, not just from a craft perspective, but tonally as well. This whole idea of grief and sorrow that we see with Llewyn and the close-ups on Oscar Isaac, the looks on his face tell us everything we need to know. And at this point, we don't know anything. We're meeting Llewyn for the very first time. And yet the direction, the performances, the song choice carry so much weight. It's so completely transfixing. Then we juxtapose that to the ending scene of the film, where we see him again on stage, this time playing Fare Thee Well. Similarly to Hang Me, it's a song of melancholy. And again, I love the variation of Oscar Isaac as Llewyn, of course, singing it live, because it is different from the soundtrack version, which still has an arresting quality to it. It's more upbeat with its melody on the soundtrack. In the film, Llewyn chooses to render the song in a much more raw and intimate way that echoes everything that we had seen previously. He's given this career all that he's had. He drove all the way to Chicago to give it one more crack. He left it all on the field, so to speak, and I do want to talk about that here in a moment. And yet, he's stuck in this adversity. So this time, Fare Thee Well is almost literal. He sings it as if he's singing it to Mike, as if he's singing it to himself. I've had a good run, but now it's time to bid Fare Thee Well. And maybe it's true that he is better with Mike, as everyone seems to remind him of and suggest. Llewyn acknowledges that even a couple of times throughout the film. So perhaps this rendition isn't quite as clean or sharp, but the catharsis is beautiful and it's elegant, especially when coupled with the Coen's direction and cinematography, as I was just talking about. Okay, let's talk about that audition scene in Chicago, though, which for my money is one of the best scenes of the 2010s, because it profoundly converges Llewyn's emotional state with his craft, amplified by, again, one of the best performances of the 2010s. Despite Llewyn's affliction, he really believes in his art and in his craft. And he is a great musician. He demonstrates this very well throughout the film. And as a way of trying to continue this musical career and move past this rut that he's in, he finds a way to Chicago, where he's going to audition for Bud Grossman, the owner of this music club there. And after meeting Bud, the two of them sit down alone in this open space, and he begins playing The Death of Queen Mary Jane. And Oscar Isaac sings this with such cogent pathos. It is remarkably palpable. It is so good, the passion he pours into this moment, which is what makes the composition and framing of the scene so evocative, as I just talked about with the bookends of the film, very much continuing that same thing here, as it's just the two of them in this rather intimate setting where the music and craft can be at its most pure. If it was simply about the art, there's no denying Llewyn as he sings this song. But at the end of it, Llewyn looks up at Bud, almost looking directly into the camera. Bud disappointedly notes that it's not marketable. I can't sell that, he says, and then suggests that he gets back together with his music partner, not knowing the context of what happened to Mike. And it is devastating. It's devastating. It's so good, and it perfectly crystallizes this duality that Llewyn had been experiencing of craft and art versus business. He's very clearly agitated by the business part of it. He finds it phony and off-putting. For Llewyn, it's all about the music. It's all about the art, but the business, for whatever reason, doesn't gravitate toward that. And when you couple that with the emotional turmoil underneath, it creates a concoction that is heartbreaking, given how it compounds on his misfortune, keeping him stuck in this cycle that he is in, and how that tethers to the ending scene of the film as I just talked about, is really great. But speaking of the cyclical nature of the film, I want to talk about that a little bit further. As I've been talking about, Llewyn is struggling to cope with how things have shifted for him. He's stuck in this never-ending cycle of misfortune. Some of it is his own doing, to be fair. Some of it is his own doing. Some of it is not. Either way, he's trapped, and he doesn't know how to do anything else or want to do anything else other than pursue music. And it's a volatile process for him. And I love how the Coen structured the film around that idea. There's a symmetry to the script that wonderfully complements Llewyn's journey. It starts with the opening scene of the film, which is actually the final scene of the film, but recontextualized slightly. And by the end, we come to see he's come full circle, landing in the exact same place in which he started. There's also the repeating motif of the cat, and perhaps what that symbolizes for Llewyn. I'll talk about that more here in a second. There's the abortion subplot with Jean, and as we come to learn, that isn't his first rodeo either. Something that is also recontextualized for Llewyn later on in the film, when Llewyn finds out that the first abortion he paid for wasn't followed through on, thus offering up this incredible affecting polarity as it relates to life and death, where one relationship ends, another could begin for him. And there's, of course, the music. As I noted, Fare Thee Well reverberates a couple of times in the film, both in context of how it sounds on Llewyn and Mike's original soundtrack on the original record, and Llewyn as a solo artist. And there is a vivid contrast between the two. Hang Me, Oh Hang Me similarly plays a few times, with its meaning evolving as the film unfolds. Or you simply think about the trajectory of his career, how it not only embodies the cyclical nature of his adversity, but how it begins and ends with Hang Me, Oh Hang Me, and Fare Thee Well. That symmetry alone, I think, is astounding. But the Coens take it a step further with an additional duality to that final moment, because that final rendition of Fare Thee Well, it's really beautiful, and maybe he found some closure with his grief and music career, or at least there's a level of acceptance, as I was alluding to. But as soon as he steps off the stage, he is told that someone wants to talk to him in the alley out in the back, outside the bar. And because of a not so beautiful exchange the night before, he's physically assaulted, reminding us that Llewyn is still in a chokehold to the cyclical nature of his life. From a writing and craft perspective, the Coens are constantly aware of the symmetry of Llewyn, and it becomes a fascinating nucleus that drives everything we see. It is so good. It's incredible. I love the nuances of it. All right, let's talk about the cat. We do need to talk about the cat and how it symbolizes Llewyn's identity crisis. Llewyn plays Fare Thee Well from the record with Mike in those opening scenes, as I talked about earlier, in which we see the cat escape for the first time. And after finding it, he starts carrying it around as if he's holding on to the past. The cat constantly tries to run away, first in the subway, then later down the fire escape. And each time, Llewyn is desperate to find it, to hold on to it, partially because it's not his cat, so there's a level of responsibility at play, but maybe there's more to it for Llewyn. Even after finding a stray and mistaking it for the Gorfine's cat, he doesn't let it go. He still holds on to the cat, like he can't let go of the past, of Mike. That is, until he gets close to Chicago. And if he's going to make it as a solo artist, he has to move on. So he leaves the cat behind, but not before the camera lingers on the cat for a good long beat, which I think is an incredible moment in this film. Of course, ironically, the audition doesn't go well, and it ends with Grossman telling Llewyn to get back with his music partner, as we just talked about. So what happens? On the way home, he hits the cat with his car, which was likely just a dream or a symbolic way of Llewyn separating himself from Mike. But either way, he has to move forward, even if everyone else around him wants to forever tether him to Mike. That, I do think, is incredible. It's done in a very Coen-esque way, But I do love how this cat, which certainly lends itself to some great levity at times, but it does add some symbolic poetry to this film that I also really, really appreciate. Speaking of a few other components to this film that I really love, Please, Mr. Kennedy, I mean, come on. That is one of the best scenes of 2013. I love that moment in this film as well. The dynamic of those three is just so incredible. You could watch that sequence on its own in a vacuum incessantly until the end of time and always find joy out of it. It is incredible. The driving sequence to Chicago, we talked about how it does add pathos to this film emotionally, thematically, but I think it's also very funny. There's some great dynamic at play there with those characters. The way this film taps into Llewyn's ego throughout the film. I mentioned the scene with Llewyn at the Gorfines' apartment, but there's also that moment at the Gaslight where Troy goes to invite Jim and Jean onto the stage, and Llewyn says, "Oh, I don't have my guitar," fully assuming that Troy was inviting him onto the stage. So even as he's struggling, his ego still has a grasp on him. You know, there's another moment later on in the film with his sister where that comes out as well. So I love how ego continues to eat at him despite that struggle, despite how that grief is getting to him. And speaking of his sister, there's an interesting layer to this film as well, in that, you know, he might not be all that close to his family. He speaks to this a little bit with his sister. There's the moment with his dad later on, and it does seem as if he's disassociated with his family, where Mike was likely the relationship that he was the closest to. And I do love how this film taps into that, because oftentimes when we see grief in movies, it's of a parent, of a child, of someone within your family most of the time. This is a movie about grief, but of a friend, of someone that you work with. And I think that makes this film distinctly unique on its own terms as well. Okay, before we wind down here, I just want to echo once again, the Coen brothers' craft here is so great. This is maybe arguably their best directed movie. The brown and hazy cinematography is so evocative. The period aesthetics are great. There's a visceral nature to it. When Llewyn is out in the cold, you really do feel that New York winter. The editing of this film, the performances are just really great. The music and sound mixing is sensational. This film is noteworthy because they did sing much, if not all of this, live there on set. So the sound mixing is vital to this film from a craft perspective, and it's really immersive and absolutely fantastic. And I cannot echo enough Oscar Isaac. It is one of the best performances of the 2000s, partially because of how great he is as a performer, as a musician, and he has to make that believable, playing the songs, singing the songs. It's how he taps into that ego, how he taps into the love and the sorrow he has for Mike. And he's also kind of funny. He's very funny throughout this film as well. He's able to do all of that so effortlessly. It's just remarkable, the nuances in his performance. My last note on this film, and then we can end this video. Much of this character is obviously inspired by Dave Van Ronk. And when you look at his career and where things go, how he championed a Bob Dylan, for example, in the folk scene of that time, eventually it gets to a point where he does see some success and things do get better for him. I love Llewyn so much as a character and what he embodies here, that grief that you see so palpably in the character. And he's such a good artist. Oscar Isaac as a singer is so compelling in this film that I choose to believe, I know the film ends in ambiguity, but I choose to believe that Llewyn does follow that same trajectory, that he does eventually find some success as Dave Van Ronk did in real life. Whether that's true or not, we will never know. The Coens will obviously never speak to it. I know we live in a world where sequels and reboots rule the day, but the Coens will not become a victim of that trap. So we'll never know, but that's what I choose to believe. At any rate, I love this movie so much. I love how it taps into all of these nuances. Like I said, it's one of my favorite films of all time. Hopefully I was able to articulate with some clarity as to why. Happy 10 years. Happy 10 years to this movie that I think is just really, really terrific. Like I said, one of the best films of all time. If you agree or disagree with anything that I had to say here, let me know. You can leave a comment below. Hit me up on social media. What do you think of Inside Llewyn Davis? What do you think of Oscar Isaac's performance? I'd love to hear your thoughts. In the meantime, I'm going to go watch this movie again, and I'm going to not so gracefully sing Fare Thee Well with you.